To comprehend the heretic Astartes, the Chaos Space Marine is to comprehend the ultimate betrayal. They are a historical document written in blood and treason, a living testament to the day the Imperium's heart was broken. Once they were the Adeptus Astartes, the finest warriors humanity had ever conceived, demigods, clad in ceramite and righteousness, the Emperor's own angels of death. They were the guardians of mankind, symbols of strength and incorruptible loyalty. Now, they are the very demons they once hunted. Their fall from grace was not merely a change in allegiance, it was a spiritual evisceration. Their glorious power armor, once a symbol of holy purpose, is now a twisted mockery, a sarcophagus of metal and malice. Runes of damnation glow with malevolent light where purity seals once hung. Holy icons have been replaced with the eight-pointed star of chaos undivided, or the grotesque sigils of their dark patrons. Their warplate is festooned with gruesome trophies, the skulls of champions, the flayed skins of saints, the eternally screaming faces of their victims. They are not merely soldiers fighting for a different cause. They are avatars of hatred, their 10,000-year-old rage given form, their every action a blasphemy against the master of mankind they once revered. Sergeant Kalen of the 77th Cappic Eagles was a man forged to fight such horrors. As a Tempestus scion, he was a product of the Schola Progenium, an orphan of the Imperium raised from infancy to be one of its most elite soldiers. Discipline was his creed, his hotshot lasgun was his deliverance, and the God Emperor was his shield. He was trained to operate behind enemy lines, to strike at the heart of the foe with precision and overwhelming force. He had faced down orc war bosses on smog-choked worlds and outmaneuvered Eldar corsairs in the ruins of ancient cities. He believed in the simple, brutal calculus of warfare: superior training, superior firepower, and unwavering faith. He believed that any threat, no matter how monstrous, could be analyzed, targeted, and neutralized. He was a professional, a scalpel in a galaxy that often required a sledgehammer. And he was one of the very best. None of it mattered. On the ash wastes of Armageddon, Secundus' professionalism was a prayer swallowed by a hurricane. The ambush had been perfect in its violence. One moment his Scion kill team was advancing through the skeletal ruins of a Promethium refinery. The next hell had opened its maw. The enemy were not guardsmen rebels or Xenos filth. They were giants clad in crimson armor, defiled by scripture in a language that made the ears bleed. The word bearers. They moved with a speed and brutality that defied their immense size. Bolter shells like miniature rockets turned his squad mates into clouds of red mist and shattered bone. A chain axe roared, and a brother he had known for a decade was sundered in two. Kalen survived. He did not know why. He had been thrown by an explosion, landing in a deep slag pit, as the last of his team was systematically, joyously butchered. When he finally crawled out, bruised and bleeding, there was only silence. The whisper of the toxic wind and the faint coppery smell of a ritual concluded. He had a fractured memory, a fleeting image seen through a haze of pain and concussion giants, standing in a circle, chanting around a sigil drawn in the blood of his men, a brief, sickening shimmer in the air. He dismissed it as a hallucination, a trick of a traumatized mind. His training took over. He was the sole survivor. His mission was clear: evade, survive, and return to Imperial lines. He was a soldier of the Imperium, and his duty was not yet done. But as he melted into the shadows of the ruined world, a lone mortal figure in a graveyard of titans, he was unaware that his role had changed. He was no longer a soldier trying to get home. He was the quarry in a hunt that had only just begun. Survival was a litany of learned responses. Kalen moved like a ghost through the industrial necropolis, his gray and crimson Cappic Eagle's carapace armor blending with the rust and decay. Every shadow was a potential hiding place, every shattered conduit a new path. He was a creature of his training, a being of pure pragmatism. He monitored the charge of his power pack, rationed his last nutrient bar, and listened. The silence was his greatest enemy. The wind whistling through shattered gantries sounded like a hunting howl. The groan of stressed metal sounded like the step of a giant. He tried his voxcaster every hour, whispering the coded distress call of his regiment, his voice swallowed by the static. Eagle 1, this is Kalen Kill Team Valerius, awaiting orders. Acknowledged. The only reply was the dead hiss of an empty channel. Armageddon Secundus was a tomb, and he was a solitary mourner in a world of ghosts. The industrial zone was a maze forged by giants and left to rust. Colossal chimneys clawed at the polluted sky like skeletal fingers. Cavernous factory floors were littered with the silent, monolithic machinery of a forgotten age. Kalen navigated this metal labyrinth with practiced ease, his senses on a razor's edge. He was looking for signs of Imperial presence, a rally point, a forward operating base, even a fresh vehicle track. Instead, he found a sign of something else entirely. In the center of a vast, echoing assembly hall, he found Private Jax. He was the last member of Kalen's team to fall, a young trooper with a quick smile, who had been saving his wages to buy a plot of land on his agri-world home. He had not been killed by a bolter round or a chain axe. Jax had been hung from a massive chain hook suspended 10 meters in the air. His body was a grotesque sculpture of pain. His skin was gone, flayed from his flesh in long, ritualistic strips. His limbs had been carefully broken and rearranged. His arms stretched wide, his legs bent unnaturally. Where his scion insignia had been on his chest, the 8-pointed star of chaos had been carved deep into the exposed muscle. It was not the work of a frenzied killer. It was the careful, deliberate work of an artist. It was a statement, a message. The clinical shock that had insulated Kalen since the ambush began to crack, and a cold, primal fear, the kind his training was meant to suppress, began to seep through. He had seen death in 100 forms, but this was different. This was violation. This was worship. The truth landed on him with the force of a physical blow. They knew he was alive. The word-bearers. The crimson-clad butchers had not simply missed him in the chaos of battle. They had let him go. This entire world was their canvas, and he was the last brushstroke they intended to make. He was not a survivor scrambling for safety. He was a mouse in a maze, and the cats were watching. Every step he took, every shadow he hid in, was part of their game. They were not in a hurry. They were savoring this. The hunt was the ritual, and his terror was their prayer. The dead silence of the Vox was not an accident. They were isolating him. The carefully placed corpse of his friend was not a warning. It was an invitation. The horror of his situation shifted from the physical threat of death to the psychological torment of a prolonged, orchestrated demise. He was no longer a soldier. He was prey. The realization that he was being hunted changed the very texture of the world around him. The silence was no longer empty. It was watchful. The shadows were no longer hiding places. They were ambush points. As he pushed deeper into the industrial wasteland, driven by a desperate need to put distance between himself and the horrific totem of his fallen friend, he caught his first glimpse of them. He was perched high on a gantry, peering through the scope of his hellgun, when he saw movement 2 kilometers away. They were not the crimson-clad word-bearers. These figures were larger, their power armor the color of a midnight sky, adorned with jagged bolts of lightning and leering, skull-faced helmets. Even from a distance, their posture spoke of a languid, predatory arrogance. They were not marching, they were stalking. They moved with a terrifying grace, their immense forms melting into the shadows, their presence an unspoken threat. Kalen's blood ran cold. He recognized the livery from 100 threat identification lectures at the Schola. They were Night Lords, the sons of Conrad Kurz, the Terror Masters, the experts in the art of breaking a man's mind long before they broke his body. The word-bearers had performed the ritual, but it seemed they had outsourced the final agonizing hunt to specialists. The psychological assault began an hour later. Kalen had taken refuge inside a fortified control tower, the panoramic windows offering a commanding view of the surrounding decay. He was scanning the horizon when his voxcaster crackled to life. Relief surged through him for a fraction of a second, a desperate hope for rescue. But it wasn't a rescue call. The sound that filled his helmet was a recording. It was Private Jax screaming. It was a raw, ragged sound of unimaginable agony, looped and distorted. Then another voice joined it. Sergeant Valerius, his team leader, begging for mercy, before his voice was cut short by a wet, tearing sound. The screams of his entire squad, his brothers in arms, were played back to him, a symphony of their final moments. And woven through it all, a low, guttural chuckle, a sound that was not human, rasped through the speaker. It was a laugh, filled with ancient cruelty and mocking contempt. It was the sound of a predator toying with its food. Kalen ripped his helmet off, gasping for air, his hands shaking. The laughter continued to echo from the helmet's external speaker, a phantom voice in the empty room. This was their strategy. They wouldn't just hunt his body, they would dismantle his sanity piece by piece. They would use the memory of his friends, the tools of his trade, his own senses against him. The professional soldier in him screamed protocols, maintain discipline, ignore provocations, treated as enemy propaganda. But the man inside, the lone survivor surrounded by the ghosts of his friends, was already starting to fray. He knew he couldn't stay in the open. The high ground that was once a tactical advantage had become a stage, and he was the sole actor in a play written for an audience of two. He had to disappear. He had to go where their size and arrogance would be a disadvantage. His eyes fell upon a massive circular sewer grate in the floor of the refinery below. It was an access point to the underhive, the sprawling, lawless labyrinth of tunnels, forgotten substructures and waste conduits that existed beneath every Imperial hive city. It was a world of absolute darkness, of mutants and outcasts, a place where the Emperor's light was a forgotten myth. For a surface dweller to enter the underhive was to accept a death sentence. But for Kalen, it was the only option left. Being hunted by demigods on the surface was a certainty of death. The darkness below offered at least a chance of it being delayed. With the disembodied laughter of the Night Lords chasing him, he descended into the stinking abyssal maw of the world beneath the world. To descend into the underhive was to be swallowed whole. Kalen left the world of open skies and distant horizons, and entered a realm of crushing man-made geology. The transition was a violent assault on the senses. The air, thin and toxic on the surface, became a thick, soupy cocktail of atomized chemicals, ozone, and the charnel stench of decay. It was a physical weight in his lungs, a taste of rust and corruption on his tongue. The darkness was not merely an absence of light. It was a tangible presence, a smothering black blanket that his military-grade photoreceptors struggled to pierce. The only illumination came from the ghostly phosphorescent green of strange fungi, clinging to the walls, or the sudden angry flash of a ruptured power cable arcing in the gloom. The silence of the surface was replaced by a new cacophony, the constant subsonic hum of colossal machinery that was the hive's distant heartbeat, the steady drip, drip, drip of corrosive fluid from pipes the size of thoroughfares, and the unseen, furtive skittering of things that thrived in the filth. This was a world that had forgotten the sun, a cancer in the planet's core. Kalen's training had prepared him for hostile environments. But this was something else. This was a place where the very architecture was an enemy. He navigated through a claustrophobic maze of rusted maintenance tunnels, across precarious walkways, spanning chasms of indeterminate depth, and through vast cathedral-like cisterns filled with stagnant, chemical-laced water. Every surface was slick with grime. Every shadow seemed to writhe with a life of its own. His discipline was his only anchor in this disorienting vertical hell. He was an intruder, an anomaly of order and cleanliness, in a realm defined by chaos and filth, and this realm was inhabited. He began to see them, the denizens of the deep dark. Gaunt figures with pallid skin and wide, dark, adapted eyes would watch him from the mouths of tunnels before melting back into the shadows. He saw a work gang of wretched laborers, their bodies stooped and their faces vacant, shuffling under the watchful gaze of a hulking overseer with a shock maul. Once he froze as a pack of gangers clad in scrap metal and wielding crude, brutal weapons passed beneath the walkway he was hiding on their laughter like the grinding of rocks. He saw mutants, their forms twisted by pollution and genetic instability, beings that the Imperium would have purged on sight, but who were simply part of the local fauna here. He was in their world now. His authority as a soldier of the Emperor meant less than nothing. Here the only law was survival, and his pristine armor and advanced weaponry marked him not as a figure of power, but as a rich source of salvage for whoever was strong or desperate enough to take it. He had to learn to move differently, to think differently. He was no longer a tempestuous scion on a mission. He was just another creature in the dark, and the rules of this new jungle were written in blood and desperation. Kalen believed that by descending into the Underhive, he had at least escaped the direct personal torment of his hunters. He was wrong. He had only traded one hunting ground for another, and he soon discovered that the influence of chaos was not limited to the demigods in midnight-clad armor. It was a stain, a psychic poison that had begun to seep into the very foundations of the world around him. His sanctuary was becoming a weapon pointed at his own mind. The first signs were subtle, easily dismissed as tricks of a stressed and exhausted psyche. He began to see patterns in the rust stains on the walls, shapes that resembled the leering faces of demons. The endless drip of water from the pipes began to sound like a sibilant whisper just at the edge of his hearing. But then, the signs became undeniable. Scrawled on the wall of a decaying transit tunnel, he found scripture. It was not the familiar comforting text of the Imperial Creed, but the alien razor-sharp glyphs of the word-bearer's faith. The words were written in what looked like a mixture of blood and industrial lubricant, and they seemed to throb with a faint, sickly luminescence in the dark. It was the litany of the Eightfold Path, a vile prayer to the ruinous powers. He was deep underground, miles from the site of the ambush, yet their presence was here waiting for him. The whispers grew louder, no longer seeming to come from the pipes, but from inside his own head, echoes of the blasphemous chanting he had half remembered from the battlefield. His flight became a journey through a landscape actively turning against him. He stumbled into a vast, silent depot for decommissioned labor servitors. Hundreds of the lobotomized cyborgs stood in silent rows, covered in dust and cobwebs, their power sources long dead. As he moved through the center of the chamber, they all activated at once. A cacophony of screeching static filled the air as their vox grills crackled to life. But instead of the monotone binary commands they were built for, they began to chant. In a discordant mechanical chorus, they recited passages from the Book of Lorgar, their voices a grotesque parody of a temple choir. Their optical sensors, once dark, now glowed with a uniform, hateful red. They didn't move to attack him. They simply stood and watched and chanted, their heads turning in perfect synchronicity to follow his every step. It was a choir of damned machines, singing praises to the architects of his misery. The message was clear: there was nowhere to hide. The very technology of the Imperium, the sacred work of the Adeptus Mechanicus, could be turned corrupted and made to serve his tormentors. His fortress was not just breached, it was haunted. The horrors of the hive were not always supernatural. The most immediate threat became the slow, grinding attrition of his own body. The last of his nutrient paste was a foul-tasting memory, and his suit's water recycler was beginning to fail, producing a thin, metallic liquid that did little to quench his thirst. His power pack was critically low, forcing him to switch off his photoreceptors and rely on his own straining, unaugmented eyes. His training had pushed him to the limits of human endurance, but even a tempestuous scion was still a man, and a man needed to eat. It was this simple biological imperative that forced him to commit the greatest sin of his career. He was stalking the darkened tunnels when he heard voices. Huddled around a small chemical fire were three figures, their faces gaunt and grimy. They were scavengers, underhivers. Their prize a small, functioning water purifier, and a handful of synth protein bars they had likely risked their lives for. The Kalen of a week ago, the sergeant of the 77th Cappic Eagles, would have seen them as Imperial citizens to be protected, or at least ignored. But that Kalen was a ghost. This Kalen, the creature of the dark, saw only a resource vital to his own survival. He wrestled with his conscience for a full minute, the tenets of the Schola Progenium warring with the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. Then, with a cold resolve that horrified him, he moved. He was a shadow, a whisper of violence. He struck from behind, using non-lethal force, his movements precise and economical. A blow to the back of a neck, a joint lock to disarm another. The fight was over in seconds. He did not kill them. But as he grabbed the purifier and the food, he saw the look in their eyes. It was not just fear. It was a weary, hopeless understanding. He was just another predator in their brutal world. For the first time in his life, he had raised his hand against the very people he had sworn an oath to defend. The food tasted like ash in his mouth. His journey continued, now burdened by a new, corrosive guilt. It was this guilt that made the next encounter so devastating. In a forgotten, sealed-off section of a Medicaid station, he found a small enclave of survivors. They were not gangers or mutants, but families huddled together against the darkness. An old woman, her face a roadmap of hardship, offered him a bowl of thin fungus broth, without a word. A small child stared at him, his eyes wide with awe at the sight of his scion armor. For a few hours in the dim light of their sanctuary, Kalen felt a flicker of his old self return. He was a guardian again, a symbol of the Imperium's strength. He helped them reinforce their barricade and shared some of the medical supplies from his kit. He felt a sense of purpose he thought he had lost forever. The feeling did not last. As night fell, the cold logic of his situation returned. The Night Lords were not hunting these people. They were hunting him. He was a beacon, and he was leading death straight to this tiny pocket of humanity. If he stayed, he would be the author of their destruction. The Night Lords would find him, and they would slaughter everyone here as a mere footnote in his psychological torture. The choice was as clear as it was agonizing. To protect them, he had to abandon them. Before the Enclave stirred for the next cycle, he slipped out of their barricade and back into the suffocating darkness. He didn't look back. He told himself it was a tactical decision, a necessary sacrifice. But he knew in the core of his being that he was also running to save himself. He had repaid their kindness with a silent betrayal, leaving them to a fate he would never know but would forever be responsible for. The guilt was no longer a burden. It was a part of him now, another crack in the armor of his soul. The hunt escalated. The Night Lords, having allowed the Underhive's natural dangers and Kalen's own failing morality to soften their target, now began to apply a more direct and technologically sophisticated pressure. They were Astartes' post-human demigods, and the ancient rotting technology of the Forge world was a toy in their hands. They turned the very infrastructure of the Underhive, Kalen's supposed hiding place, into an extension of their will, a purpose-built torture chamber. He was navigating a network of service tunnels when he came upon an abandoned prefecture control hub. It was a relic from a more prosperous age, a room filled with dozens of massive pict screens, all of them dark and coated in a thick layer of grime. He entered cautiously, hoping to find a working terminal, a map, anything that could give him an advantage. As he reached the center of the room, every screen flickered to life, simultaneously bathing him in a cold blue light. They did not show static or error messages. They showed him. Dozens of images of Sergeant Kalen, all from hidden security cameras he had passed in the last several hours. Kalen watched by Kalen. Then the images began to distort. The face on the screens, his face began to twist in silent screams of terror. His eyes widened, his mouth contorted a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. The Night Lords were not just watching him. They were showing him his own terror reflected back at him 100 times. The display shifted. The screens now showed a place he had not seen since he was a child, a memory locked away and suppressed by Schola Progenium hypno-conditioning. It was the face of his mother, his father, a family he was ordered to forget to ensure his absolute loyalty to the Imperium. The images were not memories. They were fresh, new, and horrific. They showed his parents aged and weary, being dragged from a hab block by hulking figures in midnight-clad armor. They showed them being tortured, their faces contorted in agony, their silent screams playing across the screens. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. His family was long dead, lost in some forgotten conflict. The Night Lords couldn't possibly have found them. But the images were so real, so detailed. They were a perfectly crafted fiction designed to strike at the last vestiges of his buried humanity. He cried out a raw, wounded sound and smashed one of the screens with the butt of his pistol, the glass exploding in a shower of sparks. The psychological attack was immediately followed by a physical one. As he stumbled from the control room, his mind reeling from the fabricated visions, a new sound echoed through the tunnels, a klaxon wailing and insistent. The massive ventilation fans, dormant for decades, roared to life, creating a cyclonic wind that funneled him down a specific set of corridors. The public address system, once used for work cycle announcements, now blasted a deafening cacophony of distorted martial music and the same mocking, inhuman laughter he had heard on his Vox. They were herding him using the hive's own systems like sheepdogs. He was driven into a massive, multi-leveled ore processing chamber, a nexus of gantries, conveyor belts, and grinding machinery. It was a trap. A bolt shell exploded behind him, showering him with shrapnel and sending him tumbling from a walkway. He landed hard on a pile of scrap metal below his leg, twisting with a sickening crunch. His hotshot lasgun, his last symbol of Scion authority, flew from his hands and skittered into a deep, inaccessible chasm. He had escaped, but only just. He was now grievously wounded, disarmed, and had been psychologically flayed. The game was entering its final bloody stages. Broken. He was utterly broken. Dragging his shattered leg, his body a symphony of agony, Kalen stumbled through the labyrinth. His training was a distant echo, his discipline a forgotten language. He was now just a wounded animal, driven by the last flickering instinct of survival. It was in this state, at the absolute nadir of his existence, that he founded a small, forgotten chapel of the Adeptus Ministorum, tucked away in a dusty, unused sector of the Underhive. The doors were gone and the pews were covered in a shroud of gray dust, but on the far wall a great brass aquila, though tarnished and green with age, still held its place. It was a symbol of everything he had lost. With the last of his strength, he limped to the foot of the altar and collapsed, his combat knife clattering on the stone floor. He was a tempestuous scion, a soldier of the elite. His faith had always been a thing of regulation, of recited catechisms of hate and litanies of firing discipline. He had never prayed. Not like this. Now, with nothing left, he did. He knelt in the grime and the dust, not as a soldier, but as a terrified, dying child. The words were not recited. They were torn from the raw, bleeding depths of his soul. "Emperor, hear me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have given you everything, my life, my loyalty, my brothers. I have never questioned, I have never faltered. Now, I am here, alone, hunted in the dark. I am wounded. I am broken. I ask only for a sign, a word. Just let me know you are there. Please, do not leave me to them." He waited, his head bowed, his body trembling with pain and desperate hope. He prayed for the holy silence of the divine, for a feeling of peace, for a surge of righteous strength. He received an answer. It was not the one he prayed for. A thick, dark liquid, viscous and black as oil, began to seep from the eye of the brass Aquila. It dripped down the eagle's proud face like a single black tear. The air grew cold, and a presence filled the chapel, ancient and infinitely malicious. Then a voice spoke, not to his ears but directly inside his mind. It was a calm, sibilant voice, laced with the patient amusement of a scholar observing an insect. "You plead with the carrion on his throne." The voice whispered, coiling around his thoughts like a serpent. "You offer your pain to a silent god. He does not hear you. He cannot hear you. He has been a deaf, blind, and mute corpse for 10,000 years. Kalen looked up, his eyes wide with horror. The voice was not the Emperor's. It was the voice of the enemy, the voice of the dark apostle who commanded the word-bearers, the architect of his torment. "We hear you, little soldier." The voice continued, dripping with mocking pity. "We have heard your every panicked breath, your every whimper of fear. The true gods are always listening. They delight in the prayers of the desperate. They answer those who call. Your corpse emperor knows only silence. We offer you truth." In that moment, the final foundation of Kalen's soul did not crack. It turned to dust. The unwavering bedrock faith that had guided his entire life, the belief in the divine master of mankind, for whom he had fought and bled, was revealed as a hollow lie. The Emperor was silent. The abyss, however, had answered his call. He did not scream. He simply stared at the weeping Aquila, and the last light in his eyes went out. He was truly, finally alone. Something broke in the silence of that desecrated chapel. Kalen had lost his squad, his mission, his weapon, his health, and now his faith. He had been systematically stripped of every layer of his identity. He had nothing left to lose, and in that absolute terrifying emptiness, a new feeling took root. The fear that had been his constant companion for days, the gnawing terror that had driven him into the depths, did not simply vanish. It underwent an alchemical transformation. It was compressed under the immense pressure of his despair and ignited by the spark of betrayal. His fear was burned away, and what was left was the pure, incandescent residue of hatred. He did not rise like a man reborn in holy purpose. He rose like a predator. The trembling stopped. The vacant, hunted look in his eyes was replaced by a flat, cold fire. The pain in his leg was still there, a sharp, insistent agony, but now it was just a stimulus, a reminder of the source of his rage. He picked up his combat knife, the grip feeling different in his hand. It was no longer a tool of last resort. It was now an instrument of vengeance. He was no longer Sergeant Kalen of the Cappic Eagles, a soldier of the Imperium. That man had died on his knees before a weeping icon. What stood up was something more primal, a cornered animal that had discovered its teeth. He was no longer trying to survive. He was no longer trying to escape. His objective, with the stark, simple clarity of a killing blow, was to make them hurt. His movements changed. He was no longer fleeing. He was repositioning. He was no longer hiding. He was observing. He began to use his intimate, hard-won knowledge of the Underhive's treacherous terrain, not as a refugee, but as a guerrilla. He was still the prey, but now he was a prey that bit back. He found a section of tunnel where the ceiling was unstable, weakened by centuries of corrosive seepage, and spent an hour patiently rigging a tripwire connected to a loose support beam. He found a narrow, slick pipe bridge spanning a chasm of chemical sludge and deliberately weakened its mounting bolts. He backtracked, moving in circles, creating false trails that led to dead ends or structurally unsound ground. These were not the sophisticated explosive traps of a tempestuous scion. They were the crude, spiteful snares of a creature that intended to drag its tormentors down into the filth with it. The hunt was not over, but the rules had changed. The mouse had stopped running and had begun to sharpen its claws. The laughter in the static would soon be answered by the grinding of rusted metal and the roar of a man with nothing left to fear. Driven by the cold, clear purpose of his newfound hatred, Kalen moved through the underhive with a predator's focus. He was no longer looking for a hiding place, but for a killing ground. He found it in the skeletal heart of the hive's defunct metallurgical sector. It was a colossal, cavernous foundry, a cathedral of dead industry where rivers of molten metal had once flowed. Now, it was a silent ruin of black iron and rust-red gantries. Giant, dormant furnaces stood like the idols of forgotten gods, their interiors stained with the ghostly memory of 1,000,000 tons of steel. A tangled web of narrow catwalks and conveyor belts crisscrossed the cavernous space suspended over chasms that plunged into absolute darkness. The air was thick with the smell of cold iron and ancient fires. It was a perfect arena. It was here he would make his stand. For hours he prepared. He limped through the iron forest, his injured leg a throbbing reminder of his purpose. He was no longer thinking like a soldier following doctrine, but like a trapper learning the terrain. He studied the angles, the choke points, the shadows. He noted which catwalks groaned under the slightest pressure, which massive chains hung loose, ready to be dropped. He found a pocket of flammable gas leaking from a ruptured pipe and marked its location. This was not the clean, precise battlefield of an Imperial tactician. This was a death trap, and he was its architect. He found a high, secluded alcove overlooking the main foundry floor, and weighted his combat knife in his hand, its edge now honed to a razor's sharpness. He was calm. The burning rage had settled into a solid, cold core of intent in his gut. He was done hiding. He was done running. It was time to summon the devil to his own church. He listened, straining his ears, hearing the faint, distant scrape of ceramite on steel. They were still tracking him methodically, arrogantly. He focused on the memory of the voice from his vox, the guttural, mocking laughter that had tormented him. That was the one. That was the one he wanted. The Night Lord from his nightmares, the one the word-bearers called Malachor the Flayer, the artist who had sculpted his friend's corpse. Taking a deep breath, Kalen picked up a loose piece of scrap metal and struck it hard against a rusted iron girder. The sound, a sharp metallic clang, was an obscenity in the tomb-like silence. He didn't stop. He struck it again and again, creating a slow, deliberate, rhythmic beat. Clang, clang, clang. It was not a sound of fear or desperation. It was a challenge. It was a war drum beaten by a single defiant man. It was an invitation. Down below in the oppressive darkness, the sound of scraping footsteps stopped. A silence heavy and expectant fell over the foundry. Then a new sound began, the slow, deliberate crunch of a multi-ton warrior advancing toward the call. The hunter had accepted the challenge. Malachor the Flayer entered the foundry like a god of the dark places. His midnight blue power armor, adorned with flayed faces and screaming skulls, seemed to absorb the gloom around him. He moved with a terrifying, languid grace, his skull-faced helmet scanning the gantries above, the mockery in his posture, evident even at a distance. He was an apex predator, and this was merely the final cornering of his wounded prey. The game was over. What Malachor did not account for was that the prey no longer saw itself as such. From the shadows, Kalen struck. It was not a frontal assault, but a battle fought with the environment itself. He triggered his first trap, a collapsing pile of rusted sheet metal that rained down on the Night Lord. It did little more than annoy the Astartes, the metal screeching and buckling against his ceramite pauldrons. But it was a distraction. While Malachor was turning to the noise, Kalen was already moving, limping silently along a high gantry to get behind him. The battle became a deadly dance of cat and mouse among the iron ruins. Kalen was a fleeting shadow, always out of reach, using his small size and agility to navigate the narrow, treacherous walkways where the Astartes' bulk was a hindrance. He threw bolts, dropped scrap, did anything to keep the giant off balance, to frustrate him, to fuel his arrogance. and make him careless. Malachor roared in frustration, firing his bolt pistol into the shadows, the explosions echoing like thunder through the vast chamber. Kalen knew he could not win a direct fight. His only chance was one perfectly executed blow. He led the chase towards the foundry's heart, towards a long, narrow bridge that spanned the bubbling, incandescent heart of a still active smelting pit. It was a desperate, suicidal gamble. He allowed himself to be seen, a vulnerable figure hesitating at the edge of the bridge. Malachor, his patience finally gone, let out a triumphant roar and charged his chainsword, revving to life. Kalen waited until the last possible second, until the heat of the furnace below was blistering his skin, and the shadow of the charging demigod fell over him. Then he dove to the side, throwing the small, crude, explosive device he had salvaged and jury-rigged. It wasn't powerful enough to harm the Astartes, but it was enough to shatter the ancient, corroded supports of the bridge. With a scream of tearing metal, the walkway collapsed, plunging both man and monster into the void above the molten steel. For a moment they were suspended in a terrible, fiery tableau. Malachor, roaring in fury, reached for Kalen, his metal gauntlet just inches away. In that fraction of a second, with his other hand, Kalen lunged. He drove his combat knife with all his remaining strength, not at the thick ceramite, but at a flexible, unarmored joint at the neck that he had spotted during the chase. The blade sank deep. The Chaos Space Marine, his ancient armor and demonic strength useless, plunged into the liquid fire below his roar of fury, turning into a final, inhuman shriek as he was consumed. At the last moment, Kalen's flailing hand caught a jagged piece of rebar extending from the broken precipice. He hung there, his body screaming in protest smoke, and the foul stench of burning ceramite and flesh rising from the pit below. He had done it. He had killed the monster. Dangling over the abyss, his body broken but his will triumphant, Kalen threw his head back and let out a raw, primal scream of victory, a sound of pure, undiluted hatred and bloody triumph. Kalen hauled himself onto the broken precipice, his body a single screaming nerve of pain and exhaustion. He lay there, coughing the acrid smoke from the furnace below, filling his lungs. But he was alive, and Malachor was not. A ragged, triumphant grin split his grime-caked face. He had won. Against a demigod, against all odds, the lone mortal had won. His victory scream echoed in the vast iron cathedral, a testament to his survival, to his vengeance. Then from the shadows across the chasm came a new sound. A slow, deliberate, mocking applause. Clap, clap, clap. Kalen pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the darkness, his hand gripping the hilt of his bloody knife. A figure stepped into the faint glow of the furnace light. He was a giant, even larger than the Night Lord, his power armor a deep crimson covered in flowing blasphemous scripture. In one hand he held a tall, ornate crozius, topped with a burning, 8-pointed star. It was the Dark Apostle Lord Zafan, the architect of the ambush, the master of this entire ordeal. He was not alone. Other word-bearers emerged from the shadows behind him, their bolters held at a low ready. They did not attack. They simply watched as their master smiled, a look of genuine intellectual satisfaction on his scarred face. Magnificent Zafan's voice echoed in the foundry, calm and resonant. It was the same sibilant, confident voice that had spoken to him in the chapel. A truly exquisite display of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You have exceeded all of our expectations, little scion." Kalen staggered to his feet, raising his knife. "I killed your pet monster." He spat, his voice a raw rasp. "You did." Zafan agreed with a nod. And it was the final, beautiful note in a perfectly composed symphony. "You see, you have been laboring under a misconception. This was never a hunt. A hunt ends with a simple death. This was a preparation, a forging." The Dark Apostle took a step forward, his tone shifting to that of a lecturer, patiently explaining a complex theorem. "When you witnessed our initial ritual, you were not merely an observer. You were the focal point. Our prayers didn't just reach to the Imperium. They reached into you, planting a seed in the fertile ground of your soul. You were marked, Kalen. Your spirit was chosen. He gestured around the ruined foundry. Everything that followed was simply the careful cultivation of that seed. We stripped away the weeds. First your brothers to grant you the solitude of true despair. Then we hired our allies from Nostromo, masters of their craft, to peel back the layers of your discipline with fear. They herded you into this wonderful squalor, where you were forced to shed your pointless morality simply to survive. We whispered to you in the dark, showing you how the very world could turn against you, eroding your sense of safety. Zaphan's smile widened. But the masterstroke was the chapel. The final weed to be pulled was the most stubborn your faith. We showed you the truth your Imperium denies, that the corpse emperor is silent, while our gods are always listening, always eager to answer. We emptied you of hope, of brotherhood, of discipline, of faith. We emptied you of everything. Kalen felt a cold dread that was worse than any fear he had felt before. Why, he choked out. Because a vessel must be empty before it can be filled. Zaphan said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. Your victory just now. That was the key. You did not kill Malachor in the name of your silent emperor, or for some abstract notion of duty. You killed him for yourself. You killed him out of pure, personal, beautiful hatred. And in that perfect moment of murderous rage, the seed we planted finally bloomed. The ritual is complete. The vessel is prepared. It was then that Kalen felt it. A cold that had nothing to do with the iron around him. A presence flooding into the emptiness inside him. It felt ancient, vast, and full of a billion chittering, hungry mouths. He tried to scream, to raise his knife, but his limbs would not obey. His body locked up, convulsing violently. He fell to his knees, a strangled cry escaping his lips as he felt his own consciousness, his very self being devoured from the inside out by something timeless and utterly alien. He collapsed onto the iron floor. For a long moment there was only silence. Then the body of the Tempestus Scion stirred. It pushed itself up, standing with an unnatural fluid grace. It looked across the chasm at the word-bearers. The eyes of Sergeant Kalen were gone. In their place burned 2 points of malevolent, otherworldly light. The thing wearing his body smiled a slow, terrible smile that did not belong on a human face. Lord Zaphan nodded, once a look of profound satisfaction on his face. The long preparation was over. The hunt has ended, the Dark Apostle said to his followers. The trophy is claimed.